Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This is another of our Summer Book Club series, and today we're interviewing Sir Vince Cable, Dr. Vince Cable, too, who was an economist, an academic economist, went on to become a Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament. We don't hold that against him in the episode. He was also a cabinet minister in the coalition government and subsequently leader of the Lib Dems for a few years too.
In this episode, we're going to ask Sir Vince about his book, Eclipsing the West, China, India, and the Forging of a New World. This is Cable's look at what the rise of China and India mean for the rest of the world. And we're going to ask him a little bit also about his time in government and his relationships with the governments of China and India, and whether the attempt to get closer to those governments was a wise thing or somewhat naive.
Here's our interview with him.
Well, Sir Vince Cable, Dr. Cable, thank you very much for joining us on Since Attlee and Churchill. It's great to have you.
Thank you.
So many listeners will know you best as a politician. You were a cabinet minister in the coalition government as business secretary and president of the Board of Trade from 2010 to 15, and then subsequently leader of the Liberal Democrats, among other roles in politics. But you're also an economist, and you've just published a new book, Eclipsing the West, China, India, and the Forging of a New World, which very much speaks to your background in economics. And in your career in economics, you're an academic economist at the University of Glasgow. You were chief economist at Shell. I think for our listeners, it'd be very helpful at the outset if you wouldn't mind sketching out what is the big argument that you are trying to make in this book, Eclipsing the West.
Well, first of all, I should just make a bit of a disclaimer. I'm very much at the applied end of applied economics. The book could perhaps be described as a sort of cross between economics and geopolitics. Some people are using this word geoeconomics, trying to understand the way the world is now working, where you get this interaction of economic factors, security, geopolitical competition, and so on. So that's the context. The basic thesis of the book is perhaps best summed up in a very simple chart that I had at the beginning of it, which shows that the share of the world economy accounted for by the West or the North, however you choose to describe it, the North America, Europe, Japan, has shrunk consistently and steadily from just over 60% in 1990 to just under 40% today. I mean, that's IMF estimations. And by contrast, the emerging markets, the South, the global South, have grown from 40% to 60%. There's been this enormous shift in the center of gravity in the world economy, and that is primarily accounted for by China, but increasingly by India, which is the fastest growing major economy in the world. But not just India, but countries like Vietnam, even Bangladesh, parts of Africa, mostly Southeast Asia. These are the really growing parts of the world economy. And of course, it's shifting, therefore, the balance of demand to the other side of the world.
That distinction that you draw between the global North and global South, or say the West and the non-West, I wonder if it's possible it's actually more dramatic, this shift, than some people may realize, because of course the United States has in some respects still been going gangbusters in recent years, and the US economy, say compared to growth levels in Europe or some other countries in the West. But there's this great open question of, well, is the American economic growth actually driven by this once in a generation, perhaps even once a century, some might say, transformation in technology? Or is it actually being driven by a boom that's going to turn into a bust, including in the American stock markets? I mean, from a European perspective, if we percolate a little bit to our own continent, is this an even more dramatic shift in global economic power.
Yes, and I think you've put the point extremely well that within the global north there has been there are two stories really, which is the effective stagnation of Europe, including the UK, and also Japan, since their respective financial crises. The Japanese since about 1990, the European Union and the UK since 2008. Property growth has effectively stalled. Business investment has dried up. It's compounded in the British case by Brexit, but economy is growing at 1.5%. And the United States, within the global north, seemingly more dynamic. And I do buy into that to a degree. It may well be that the current boom in stock prices hits the buffers at some point, but I'm not completely negative about it. I mean, there is earnings growth as well as stock price growth, and it may well be that the United States has greater dynamism than the rest of the Western world. But this doesn't change the big global picture because the United States may be growing at 2.5%, 2%, as opposed to 1.5% in the rest of the developed world. But if India is growing at 7%, even with India's current financial difficulties, there's an enormous disparity. And compound interest is a very powerful thing. And when you look forward a couple of decades, you get a completely different balance in the world economy.
And I wanted to ask you a few questions about India. You first said you visited India in the 1960s when you were a student. So you've had, I guess, nearly 6 decades now of visiting that country and seeing its transformation. What were some of your impressions of the country then compared to now? In other words, what do you think are the biggest differences that you've seen in the development of the Indian economy?
Well, there has been an enormous transformation, and it's something I think Westerners, and for that matter, the Chinese, find it very difficult to get their heads around and tend to dismiss India as a dirty, messy place where things are disorganized and rather corrupt and nothing works. But actually, under the surface, an enormous amount's changed. I mean, from my personal experience point of view, I've been going to India for 60 years. Partly for personal reasons. My late wife was from India, and I have Indian in-laws, so I visit. Writing about India for the Economist mainly in the 80s and 90s. Going there as a politician when I was in the cabinet, and more recently just writing about it, working with academics. So I've seen different perspectives. I mean, you've seen an enormous amount of improvement in the infrastructure, which used to be unbelievably awful. It took a weekend to get a telephone call booked, and the rail system that is still not ideal. But there's been a massive improvement in infrastructure. The whole country is now digitized. Every Indian has a digital identity, which opens up the possibility for them of, securing credit, starting a business, finding out who they are, resolving property disputes, all of the things that have held back development in rural areas. Uh, the simple growth statistics are very powerful, even if you quibble a little bit with Indian statistical methods and the accuracy of the numbers, but it's transparent that there's been an enormous growth in almost every aspect. Where India has fallen down very badly is not following the Korea, China model of development with manufacturing export growth. So they've never had that drive. Of course, potentially they can now move into that space, though of course it's in a somewhat more protectionist era. But all of the Indian growth, which is the acceleration, particularly after 1991, 92, with the Manmohan Singh reforms, which took India almost to double-digit growth, and the period at the moment, the post 2014, the Modi BJP era. They're growing up 6, 7, 8%. Very close to business. You could argue it's a kind of crony capitalism in India, but it's nonetheless got a lot of dynamism. And I think that's what a lot of outsiders have missed.
I'm interested in this idea that you mentioned there about people missing India, because we do talk about China a great deal, but India rather less. And you say in your book, India is on track within a generation to become another China in its weight in the world economy. Thinking about Britain and British politics and how we position ourselves in the world, to what extent have we also been guilty of missing the rise of India and seeking to try and position ourselves to benefit from that?
Well, I think the first point I would make is a slightly sort of anarchy economist point, which is how we measure economic size. I mean, the traditional way of doing it is you just look at the GNP at current exchange rates. And if that's the case, India isn't a particularly big economy. It's below the UK, unbelievably. But of course, this is a very misleading way of looking at economic size because price levels are enormously different in the two places, as we know. And if you've got $100 or £100, you get far more for your money in India than you would here. And once you correct for price level differences, which are essentially exchange rate issues, you get a totally different story. And on a purchasing power basis, which is how the IMF, the World Bank, and the UN measure the world, India is probably now the third biggest economy in the world, and the UK eighth or ninth, something of that order. But the problem is that very often in economic commentary, we continue to use, the conventional way of measuring economic size. I saw there was a bit in I think, the leading financial papers in the UK a few weeks ago about how Britain had overtaken India to be once again the fifth biggest economy in the world. And Britain was growing at 1% and then India at 7%. I mean, it's just boggled the imagination that people could be so obtuse. But it was just an exchange rate phenomenon. The rupee is relatively weak at the moment, and that's telling a story in itself. But it's got nothing to do with economic size and importance. So I think part of the reason people haven't taken India as seriously as they should is simply is a measurements issue. I mean, I think it's also a recognition that compared with China, India is messy. The infrastructure is not at the kind of world-class level you get in the big Chinese cities. It's still very much a low-income country. There are parts of India, the big states, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, which are at kind of, sub-Saharan African levels of income, still very, very poor. But there are parts of India, notably in the south, but not only, where you're upper middle income country. So it's a vast place like China, 1.4 billion people, vast disparities. And it is difficult to see the big picture.
I went to India for the first time back in November, and I went to, among other places, Bengaluru, and I was quite struck there about all of the economic dynamism which you've talked about, which was clearly on display. We were meeting with prospective students and Queen Mary alumni who have returned there to work in tech in Bangalore. The airport is one of the most amazing airports that I've ever been to, and I know that they're working very hard to improve the transport network there. I think what you say about the sort of sniffiness about India, particularly I think from the Chinese, is quite notable. And having also spent some time in China, I think part of that comes from a Chinese suspicion of democracy, or at least there's this view that democracy can be associated with more chaos and less efficiency. Should we regard the rise of India in terms of the rise of a democracy as a counterweight to an undemocratic China? Or do you think it's not useful to think of India and China in those particular terms?
I think some people like to use India as part of a sort of Cold War narrative, democratic India versus China. This was particularly true in the Biden era. I think with Trump, we don't hear about that. He doesn't care whether countries are democratic or not. But certainly that has been that attempt to polarize in that way. It is rather misleading. I mean, India is in many ways a very vibrant and impressive democracy, and governments do get thrown out at state level and occasionally at national level. But I think it's now best described as semi-democratic, a bit like the United States. I mean, there are enormous flaws. NGOs have been suppressed quite severely. The national narrative in the media is very much government led. Opposition politicians have a hard time. It's not a kind of vibrant democracy in I suppose what you might call a Western European sense, but nonetheless, it's there. It does mean that governments get feedback from the public when things are going wrong. The BJP government thought at the last general election it was going to win a landslide, and it didn't, and it lost seats even in its own heartland. And that was a shock, the realization that they were getting some things wrong, and arguably a course correction, whereas the Chinese don't have that. I mean, there are great strengths to the Chinese system, which I openly admire in some ways. Their ability to think long term, the ability to maintain a sense of order, the ability to decentralize within in other words, centralized political system, this remarkable ability to marry communism and capitalism in some kind of working system. I mean, these are all impressive stuff. But nonetheless, it has some fundamental limitations. There is a lack of feedback. You saw this with the COVID, which was very badly handled at the end. The government didn't get the message that people hated overreaction in the lockdown. And they make other mistakes as well. And I think in the long run, this is going to be highly problematic for them.
And on that matter about China's kind of internal political organization, I guess there's been a very long-standing debate about the extent to which Western policymakers should take into account concerns relating to human rights when it comes to dealing with China. And I thought it's quite notable that in the book, you have a passage where you talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre and the response of President George H.W. Bush to that. And you say that crucially, President George H.W. Bush saw the bigger, longer term picture. And by that, I took it that you thought it was right that the United States did not simply cut out China as a result of that massacre. Um, so, from your perspective, what role should human rights play in the formulation of foreign policy? Should we take an interest in how countries organize themselves internally, or when we think about these big geopolitical, geoeconomic, as you say, questions, that really we need to take a wider view?
Well, I used to be very fastidious about these things and used to sign all these motions in the House of Commons, along with Jeremy Corbyn and others, deploring human rights abuse in about 120 countries in the world. And I boycotted dinner with the King of Saudi Arabia, amongst other things. But I think I've changed in the sense of recognizing that uh, realism, unfortunately, is a fact of life, and Britain isn't in a position to impose human rights standards on the rest of the world. And frankly, it'd be hypocritical too. We've got many own lapses, and we tolerate many things in for cynical reasons. And I think going around lecturing the rest of the world and finger wagging is utterly, completely counterproductive. One of the things I did discover in dealing with China at a kind of ministerial level is that there are lots of things you can talk about privately that they immediately gang up if you start finger wagging, as they put it. You can have a perfectly intelligent conversation with them about Tibet or other issues, and they will argue from their point of view, why they act the way they do, which is about maintaining order, territorial integrity, these things that they value. So I honestly don't think that the Western style of lecturing is remotely productive, and it isn't just that it's difficult in our dealings with China, but in India too, right? I mean, it's a country of 1.4 billion. There are enormous human rights abuses around India, problems in Kashmir, minorities who get a very rough deal. I mean, do we cut ourselves off from the global south because there are very few countries there that satisfy ideals on human rights terms? So it isn't that I've become more cynical, I've become more realistic, I think.
I'm interested in the way in which you sort of described that change, and I wonder in part, is it a change between being an MP and not being an MP, or did the change for you come when you entered government? I mean, I think as contrast, for example, that the now leader of the party for which you were an MP, Ed Davey, has chosen himself to boycott events on occasions, and most notably boycotted the state dinner for Donald Trump, which of course is a totally different can of worms to open up with the United States. And when he did that, I wondered, well, not least, would he do that if he actually thought he was going to be in government again, or if he was in government, rather like yourself, around the cabinet table of the coalition? So I wonder whether or not what changed your mind on this was the difference between being an MP then and not today, having retired from the House of Commons, or whether it was the experience of government that made you a little bit more of a realist.
Well, I think you've hit on a very good point. I think the experience of government is critical. So, I mean, when I was in government, I was constantly having to balance these things. I mean, a key issue, for example, was the arms trade. I mean, that was one of the things I was responsible for. You can't act unilaterally as trade secretary on arms, but you are the lead department. And I was faced with many issues where moral concerns entered in. For example, took the lead in stopping arms exports to Israel in the first Gaza war. I found myself denounced for anti-Semitism by the Israelis and by the Palestinians for not acting quickly enough. It's the kind of situation you get yourself into. You do have these issues. I was asked, I think, in my first week as a cabinet minister, about how I proposed to deal with Saudi Arabia, and I agreed to have a photograph with the Saudi ambassador in London to make sure that I wasn't, poking a hornet's nest. But equally, I'd no wish to go there, and made it fairly clear I'd no particular wish to go there. But Saudi's changed these days. I mean, I probably would have a more relaxed view of it now that they've change their approach to the role of women in society. But I think being in government is probably crucial. I don't, in that sense, in any way want to criticise Ed. I mean, I think if I'd been in his position today, I wouldn't have wanted to go to dinner with President Trump either. I think it was probably a good way of signalling, that we have to make ourselves more independent of the US. I mean, that's now become fairly obvious to everybody, but I think the time he did it, it was quite a brave thing to do.
There are several themes that you discuss in the book and that are considered, including this idea of blocks of countries. So countries not just as their own actors or their own independent agents, but as being part of a block. And I'm also conscious that within those blocks that there are discrepancies and differences in terms of the power, both economic and political, that members of those blocks will operate. And I say that as an introduction to shifting the thinking a little bit to the role of the United States and how that might approach some of these issues. Because there may be listeners thinking that, well, of course, you're right about Britain's ability to influence China on human rights abuses, but maybe the United States has still got more power and still got more influence to do that. So I'm thinking in particular of when Joe Biden accused China of genocide over Xinjiang and what had happened there, and also imposed sanctions over what was happening in Hong Kong. Do you think the United States has more of a, well, I assume we would all probably say the United States has more influence than smaller countries in the West on these questions. But do you think that means that those actions from on his part are helpful or still not necessarily productive?
Well, I think both of the examples you chose originated in the Biden era, I think, from what I recall.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it was part of a view of the world which the Americans then had and we shared. The concept of the Western world, although it was no longer based on the same dominance economically as we once had a set of alliances. And these alliances were either very explicit, like NATO, or they were increases, kind of subtle. A good example being the Quad with the US, India, Australia, and Japan, which is highly significant in East Asia. And the strength of the United States and the Western world rested on this alliance system. I mean, Trump has broken that down. I mean, just treated it with complete contempt, and we no longer have that. But the alliance system wasn't based on common approach to human rights. I mean, Saudi Arabia was a key pivot, key building block of Western alliances. You mentioned the accusations of genocide in relation to China. Well, the genocide watch list has about 30 countries on it. China was, I don't know about now, but certainly was pretty high up on the list. But so was India. India was top of the list at one point. So do we discontinue our relationship with India because it's failed one of the human rights tests? I, I, I think actually that whole episode of lecturing the Chinese on human rights was eventually counterproductive. And the Chinese are now, I wouldn't say getting their own back, but now re-establishing their ascendancy in that relationship.
When China was admitted into the World Trade Organization, the end of the Bill Clinton era, there was a lot of hope that this would lead not only to China's integration into the global economy, but that it would also lead to liberalization and political reform within China. Um, in fact, it seems that since that time, the Chinese government has been able to exert greater control over the sort of individual liberties of Chinese people, not least through its ability to shape internet usage and monitoring of citizens. Do you expect that China will at some point liberalize or even democratize, or do you think that this status quo will persist for quite some time to come in China?
Well, when I raised this issue with my friends in China, they say, well, actually, we never promised that when we entered the World Trade Organization, we were going to progress step by step to a democratic system. You may have had that idea, but we never undertook it. And we always took the view very, very clearly, and Deng Xiaoping was quite explicit about this, that Chinese modernization was about economic liberalization. It wasn't about political liberalization. He said at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union that Gorbachev was a fool. I think he used that language. He said, look, the only way a country like China can modernize is by maintaining very strong political discipline and unity. And this has to take place in their language, with the leadership of the Communist Party, but under a somewhat authoritarian system. But nonetheless, you can have a high degree of economic liberalization and personal freedoms. Now, what the Chinese tend to mean by personal freedoms is not running out into the street with a placard denouncing the president. It's being able to go about your business. It's crucially being able to travel abroad, as hundreds of millions of Chinese do. They leave and they go back. It means the freedom to travel within China. There's an enormous amount of protest in China. Not too many people are aware of that, I think. But it's not like North Korea. It's not totalitarian. There are lots of protests, strikes. Very often the Communist Party adopts them, takes them over, adopts the cause, but then locks up the troublemakers as they regard them. The internet control is through the Great Firewall is indeed severe. But if you're a middle-class professional Chinese, you buy a VPN. And as far as I know, people haven't been locked up for using VPNs. Tens of millions of people use them. I have a social media account in China, so-called Xiaohongshu, Red Note, and I've got, I think, 200,000 followers. And we've been censored once, but my Chinese team went to the censors and said, "What's all this about?" And they couldn't give a good explanation, so they apologized and reinstated it. And it's kind of strange. I think a lot of middle-class, professional, liberal-minded Chinese find it that they can live within the system. They may not be very courageous, and they're not standing up and protesting for human rights, but they live within the system. The question is, where is all this ultimately going? I think 10 years ago, there was some indication that the Chinese system was liberalizing politically. But then Xi Jinping came to power, and one of his main claims was stopping disorder. There was an enormous amount of corruption, freewheeling behavior, and the crackdown on corruption has tended to coincide with less liberal approaches to freedom of expression. In the very long term, I think a lot of thinking Chinese would argue that, what we really would like to be is, Singapore times 100. A scaled up version of Singapore where one party is always in power, but, you have elections. Where you have a degree of dissent, but of course people don't dissent too strongly because they get sued for libel. The kind of Singapore model, which has strong elements of democracy, but is nonetheless fairly tightly managed and disciplined and very orderly. That I think is the Chinese vision. But how you bring that about in such a vast country is difficult to see.
I want to ask about changing gears a little bit to ask about Donald Trump. You write in the book, I think it's quite a striking line. You say Donald Trump is one of the few politicians in history to have changed the economic orthodoxies of his time. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about what you understand to be the changed economic orthodoxy that Donald Trump has brought about. Has this new orthodoxy been universally accepted, or are we actually now in an era where there is no accepted economic orthodoxy? We're in a period of flux.
Well, that sentence really is the summary of a book I wrote a few years ago called Money and Power, which was economic history. It was about the great politicians of history who have changed the way that economic policy functioned and our views about economic orthodoxy. And the people I profiled, I started with Alexander Hamilton in the US, Peel in the UK, free trade, Bismarck in Germany, Roosevelt, of course. And then in the post-war era, I had Margaret Thatcher, had Deng Xiaoping, various others, Manmohan Singh in India, and so on. And I finished with Trump. And people thought, well, come on, this guy's a joke. I mean, why are you treating him as a serious thinker about economic policy? Well, of course, he's not. But what he has changed is the paradigm, the idea of the globally integrated trade and investment flows are for the common good, the kind of liberal economic orthodoxy, which has largely prevailed in the post-war period. He just smashed that with an axe. I mean, you know, it's about international economics as a zero-sum game, very kind of mercantilist approach to trade. And he has, you know, he's brought about a new way of thinking about economic problems, which maybe is wrong. I'm in my view, but you know, I'm not president of the United States, but has been very radical and has changed the economic orthodoxy of the era.
I wanted to move us on to thinking about the UK and how we respond to some of the changes that you write about in your book, and more broadly about how the UK interacts with the world economy. And starting with foreign investment, in that the coalition government of which you were a part was one of many which were very keen to encourage more foreign investment coming into the UK. Not unique to that government, of course, the Thatcher government, Major government, Blair governments all took fairly similar approaches. It's one of those things where I think our political class has generally been very agreed on it, but actually lots of the public aren't, and there are backlashes at times to what the consequence of foreign investment can ultimately mean. If that means, for example, a Chinese-owned steel company, or if that means an American-owned chocolate company, for example, to think about some examples that have been salient in recent years. How much of an unalloyed good should we say that it is for Britain to be the beneficiary of foreign investment? Or would some of the cynics, perhaps adopting the slightly more Trumpian nationalistic worldview of the world economy, be right to say that actually foreign investment might sound good because it's a term that is written to sound good, but it comes with negatives as well as positives for economies like the UK?
Well, it's not an unalloyed good, to use your word. I mean, I think on balance, it's in Britain's interest to be an open economy. And I think, you know, foreign investment or fixed foreign investment has placed an important role in that. But it's not unalloyed. And well, to give the positives first, if you look at the history of the British car industry was dying. A combination of terrible management, poor shareholders, you know, difficulties with the labour force. It was dying, and what brought the British car industry back to life was inward investment from the Japanese companies, mainly Nissan and others, from Ford, from the US, from BMW, you know, taking over the mini plants and others. You know, and foreign investment in the car industry was a great boom for the UK economy. But it's not unalloyed, and certainly when I was in government, I took a very hostile view to some of the proposed takeovers. The classic case was AstraZeneca, where I took the view that Pfizer were going to take over a very good British company and make it much more short term and undermine its R&D commitments. We didn't have the powers to stop it because takeover rules are set at the European level. But I persuaded my colleagues that this was not something we should welcome and we should do all in our power to obstruct it, which we did, and we succeeded. We basically persuaded the Pfizer that they weren't welcome and they went away. And I think we probably should have done that with more. takeovers, and there are certain I would regard as sort of fundamental assets. I mean, ARM would be a good example in the design of chips. I think fundamental national assets we should have protected. Indeed, one of the things I tried to do when I was Secretary of State was work with Macron, who was then my equivalent in France, to try and change the European takeover legislation to enable us to block takeovers of that kind. So, going back to your word, which I think is exactly right, unalloyed. No, I'm not in favor of unalloyed foreign investment, but alloyed, yes, yeah. In many cases, it's good, and for Britain to be seen as an open economy and open to new ideas, new technologies, and sources of capital.
As Secretary of State for Business and President of the Board of Trade, attracting business investment from, let's say, China and India in particular, given the subject of your book, to the UK, and also opening up business opportunities for UK businesses in China and India was a major responsibility that you had. I wonder for our listeners if you could pull back the curtain a little bit and actually tell us, what does that look like? What do you do as a cabinet secretary, business secretary, to attract investment to the UK and to China? How much is it, for example, is minister to minister? Is it mostly done by officials behind the scenes and you come in at the end and make the big calls and sign off the agreements? Is there a degree of personal diplomacy that goes on? Do you have to meet with business leaders and try and actually make the case to a business leader? I mean, how do you actually attract investment as a Secretary of State?
Largely speaking, ministers don't get involved, but if there is an issue, you do. And since we're talking about China and India, I'll quote some examples. In the case of India, because the biggest inward investor was Tata, which took over Jaguar Land Rover with very positive consequences, and also had the British steel industry in South Wales, less successfully. And the key to that was a man called Ratan Tata, who is, I think, now passed on. And he wanted a personal relationship with me to reassure him that the British government was committed to working with his company, that we supported manufacturing, and we were going to do what we could within our open market economy to support the car industry through an industrial strategy, which we had. And it turned out that Ratan Tata had been badly offended by my predecessor, Mr. Mandelson. Quite why, I never quite got to the bottom of it, but they obviously had very bad chemistry. And Ratan Tata was saying, well, why do we stay in this country when we have a minister who insults us? I don't know what had happened, but they'd taken personal affront. And so I worked hard to develop a good relationship with Tata, and did so, I think. And the fact that I had quite a lot of Indian background certainly helped. So yes, personal relationships mattered in his case, and I think it certainly helped give confidence to put more money into the British car industry, Jaguar Land Rover. A key figure in all that, of course, was a man called Lord Bhattacharya, who you may remember, who was a key Indian academic and industrialist, played a major role in Warwick University in helping to cement that relationship. So personalities did matter. In the case of China, there was less Chinese investment at that stage. I did have good relationships with a Chinese business who initially wanted to invest in making taxis in Coventry. And they did so. I personally got involved in it with the local MPs. We did everything to encourage the Chinese companies. They've doubled down. They've converted them into electric vehicles. It's been a big success. I also have to say I was keen that we worked with Huawei who were a very good partner of British telecoms companies. And that thinking, I think, carried over when I left with the Theresa May administration. But it was then kiboshed after American objections to Huawei being in 5G, and they were ripped out of the system. I think a terrible mistake. But again, that was a big company that I personally encouraged them to set up their R&D center here, which they did. I worry at the moment that the phrase national security is being used rather promiscuously to block projects which would otherwise be beneficial to the UK. I've just written an article about the exclusion of Mingyang from turbine manufacture in Scotland. Inexplicable. I mean, there's a very good partnership with Octopus. The Scottish government has worked on it for 2 or 3 years, and out of the blue, somebody of the British government says national security is not explain what that means or how it can be countered, but it's used to block the Chinese. So there is that kind of thing going on, which I worry about, and it's not rational and not helpful.
It sounds to me from the response you gave there as if you still have an affection for at least the ambition to create a golden age of Anglo-Chinese relationships, which of course was something that the coalition government would speak about more than a decade ago. The way in which that's often framed now, you've described part of it with the national security concerns, but I think it's also sometimes phrased as that was a time in which Britain was trying to maximize economic opportunity, but was naive to the geopolitics of the world in the way in which China is, I think, undeniably a strategic threat to the West and seeks to be, in many respects, a strategic threat to the West, given its own policies that it pursues. To what extent do you accept the criticism that the idea of the golden era and seeking to maximize economic benefit from the Chinese relationship was naive? Of, in fact, some of the changes that you're describing, in fact, in this book, the total tipping in a different direction of the global economic order.
I don't know who came up with the phrase golden era. I'm not even sure it was the British. It's created a legacy which is unfortunate. I mean, the way I have always approached dealing with the Chinese comes from my years in Shell, right? When I, amongst other things, I was sent out briefly to China to do all the scoping around big Shell investments in China in the 1990s. I did the same thing in India. And the classic businessman's approach to this problem, which I adopted as I was in a large multinational company, is you drew a little graph on the whiteboard which has threats on one axis and opportunities on the other, and you're quite explicit and hard-headed about identifying what the threats and opportunities are, and you try where possible to get into the bottom right-hand corner where the opportunities are and the threats are minimum. And that was certainly my approach to it in government. I think it would be naive to imagine the Chinese are, we're not dealing with a big version of Denmark or New Zealand. It clearly isn't. And there are genuine security concerns, or cyber security. It was the problem when I was there. You always had to leave your mobile behind when you went to China. But one of the things I discovered, for example, I hadn't been aware of, is that Huawei had a very intimate relationship with organizations called GCHQ, right at the heart of British security. And I questioned that initially. I said, what's going on here? At least isn't this considered a communist country? It may not be totally aligned with us. And the answer was, well, we're aware of that. We're aware of the risks. But risks are there to be managed, and we are managing them, and we can continue to have a fruitful relationship. And that's my whole approach to China, and it was my approach in government and has been since. And I think the people in government I was working with, Osborne and others, had a similar attitude. And there were occasions, for example, when we agreed to join the Asia Infrastructure Bank over American objections, where it was right to say, well, we're going to do a sensible thing, even if our American friends don't like it. So that's in a way summarizes my approach to China. It's not naive. It is aware of the risks, but also aware of the opportunities.
I think we're coming to the last couple of questions now, if that's all right. Um, so from me, I just wanted to take a step back and think about where your book sat in a kind of, I think, a genre of writing about geoeconomics or international relations, which takes a big picture view of the world, of the global economy, and of these different rising and falling powers. And sometimes when I read these books, and I can remember back when I was a teenager, I think one of the first books I read in this genre was Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. And I think a, a potential critique that can be made of these books is that they don't um, perhaps wrestle as much with the power of national identity for democratic publics. To the extent that national identity is dealt with, it's often viewed as a sort of backward impediment. But national identity is very powerful and potent for many ordinary people, and I think it is often tied to people's sense of where democratic decisions ought to be made, or where decisions ought to be made about their lives, which is more at the national level than at these bigger levels or supranational levels. So how do you square being someone who's both an economist who's worked at almost a global level, but also having been an elected politician in our national parliament? How do you square the, I think, real sentiments of, say, national pride and identity that the public can often feel with these, what you see as the kind of the bigger picture challenges that face us at a global level?
Well, I'm certainly very conscious of the importance of the politics of identity. Actually, I think the best things I've ever written were two very obscure pamphlets for a think tank called Demos, which were the politics of identity. These were written in 30 years ago. And I'd sort of anticipated the rise of, Reform Party and Farage and anti-immigration and all that stuff, and tried to analyze why it would happen, why it was beginning to happen, and how we respond to it. It's not lack of awareness of identity. As a practical politician knocking on doors, you're very conscious that um, identity in both a positive patriotic way or in an ugly sectarian racist way are very much part of political life, and we've seen it come very much to the fore. So how do you deal with this, philosophically and in practice? I mean, there's this awful ugly concept of subsidiarity, which used to be thrown around in the European Union, which it's an awful word and terribly bureaucratic, but it actually captures what we should be doing, which is trying to push decision making down as far as we possibly can to the lowest level, but recognizing that some problems have to be dealt with at a higher level. And I think in the UK, we should be embracing decentralization, the Andy Burnham agenda, if you like, getting power out of Whitehall into local authorities, because we'd had far too little of that. But there are some issues dealt with at a European level. I mean, I've always been a strong, pro-Europe. And there are some issues that just have to be dealt with at a global level. It's unavoidable. You have to have rules around international trade and finance. You have to have rules to deal with global externalities like global warming, pandemics, and so on. I mean, this is unavoidable if the world is not just going to collapse into the anarchy and violence we saw in the interwar period. So you have to have going back to that horrible word subsidiarity, have to have a system of rules operating at very local level and at the global level. I know that's quite a difficult message on the doorsteps where people want everything simple, but I'm afraid that's the only way we're going to make any headway.
If you think about British politics and how British politicians have positioned themselves and related to the world in recent years, two key relationships have dominated really for the last decade. Of course, the Anglo-American relationship and all of the talk that we have about managing Trump, and perhaps most notably of all, Britain's relationship with the European Union. Relations with China and India have really barely featured, and at times I've almost had my head in my hands at how parochial British governments have been, even when engaging with other countries. I think about Keir Starmer's visit to China recently, when part of what was being briefed about it was that this is a message about how we're going to reduce the cost of living at home, which just felt like an incredibly small and narrow way in which to frame the first visit from a British Prime Minister to China since Theresa May was Prime Minister. I wonder if you feel that British politics has been too, well, parochial perhaps in one sense, but also just too focused on questions like the European Union and our relationship to it, and too keen to neglect China and India.
Um, Yes, I think we tend to be very parochial. It's not surprising in a way. I mean, we for many years until Brexit, we were very closely bound up with our relationship with our European neighbours because they are our neighbours and our biggest trade partners. So, unsurprising. And we were very much tied into the Anglo-American relationship essentially because of defence, but also economics to a degree. So it was unsurprising that this was our major preoccupation. And India, sadly, until very recently, had a very minuscule share of British exports, of British trade, where the interaction was mainly through migration, I think. Um, China, in a way, even more remote, though China now has a significantly bigger role in our trade. So I think it's unsurprising. My approach to it now is to say that our traditional relationships with Europe and America have changed fundamentally for different reasons. But we need, as a middle power, to hedge against risk, to build up coalitions of interest on specific issues. And, we may well have a strong common interest with the Chinese on, say, green technology, which really does matter to us in the long run. And we should work with them on that. And, with India, because we have, a lot of common bonds, because they are emerging very, very rapidly. And there are sort of common features of the way we run our respective countries, which mean we can have a sensible dialogue with them. It's essentially about hedging risk, I think, is the way I would put it in a world which is increasingly dangerous and uncertain.
Well, Sir Vince Cable, Dr. Cable, thank you very much for your time today on Since Attlee and Churchill. As a reminder to our listeners, the book is called Eclipsing the West, China, India, and the Forging of a New World. Thank you very much for joining us today.